the program.
Got it.
There we go. Okay, so I would like to welcome everyone to this evening's program, a virtual visit at the Philadelphia Art Museum. My name is Raina Jose, and I'm president of Temple Ohev Shalom Sisterhood. I won't take up too much time, but I do want to say thank you to all of you and all of the people who participated in Sisterhood's donor campaign. Your donation will go towards the many things that Sisterhood does throughout the year. For example, but not limited to, speaker programs just like this evening, gifts to the Temple's college students, providing various holiday treats for our religious school students, purchasing decorations for our sukkah, purchasing gifts to our B'nai Mitzvah students, and the list goes on and on. Additionally, your donation will help Sisterhood provide our temple with a sizable gift to its operating budget. So thank you all so much. Some people to thank. Karen Ball, who last year suggested this wonderful program, and she reached out to her sorority sister, Kathy, who's a member of the Philadelphia Art Museum's board, and Kathy so graciously agreed to do this evening's program. So thank you to Karen and to Kathy, and you'll hear a little bit more about Kathy in just a minute. A thank you to Jeanette Krebs, who will be introducing Kathy and who will be handling your questions this evening. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Denise Miskin, who is Sisterhood's immediate past president and who has been our donor chairperson for the last couple of years. Denise has worked tirelessly on this year's campaign and on this evening's program. Because of Denise and all of you, I'm happy to announce that we surpassed our campaign goal, which is just wonderful. So thank you all again. So now I will turn it over to Jeanette, who will be introducing our presenter, Kathy. Take it away, Jeanette.
Great. Thanks, Raina. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that at the end of the program, Kathy will be taking some questions, so you can put them in the chat. And as I said, we'll get to those after her program. I know you're all going to love it. We got a little preview last night, Denise and Raina and Karen and I, and it's going to be really great. So it is my pleasure to introduce Kathy Sachs, to tell you a little bit about her and her involvement with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Interestingly, Kathy started in the mailroom, essentially, at the museum, where she stuffed envelopes for an upcoming Van Gogh exhibit in 1970. She then worked in the public relations department for 2 years, became a guide, chaired a donor group, and in 1991 went to work in the European painting department for the chief curator, Joe Rischel. She was involved with 4 exhibitions with him, starting with the Cezanne exhibit in 1995 and 96. And I don't know about some of you, but I remember that exhibit. It was really wonderful. And ending with Cezanne and Beyond. She was at the museum for almost 20 years. She retired as an adjunct curator after Cezanne and Beyond in 2009, and now serves as a museum trustee, chair of the Contemporary Art Committee, and co-chair of the museum's campaign. At the museum, Kathy and her late husband, Keith, endowed the contemporary curator, named the gallery dedicated to the work of Jasper Johns, and promised a large part of their collection to the museum, for which the modern and contemporary galleries are named for them. Kathy is an emeritus trustee of the University of Pennsylvania. She chaired the board of overseers of the Institute of Contemporary Art and was influential in founding Penn's Art Day, bringing together the volunteer leadership of schools and centers across Penn to promote art and culture. She and Keith established the Sachs Professorship in Contemporary Art in the Department of History of Art, along with a fund for contemporary art programming. They endowed a visiting professorship in fine arts at the School of Design and created the Sachs Guest Curator Program, which enables outside curators to work with the Institute of Contemporary Art staff and the university to organize and present major exhibitions. In 2016, they established the Sachs Program for Art Innovation, which provides grants and resources to faculty, artists, students, and other arts advocates at Penn. The vision is that the arts of Penn are recognized as a strategic priority for the university and are valued and embraced as creative catalysts across the campus. With that, I am so happy to give you Kathy Sachs.
Thank you very, very much. It's really nice to be here, and thank you very much, Karen, for the invitation. Can you all see the screen? Because my screen is totally full screen, the tour. Can you see that? So everybody has the same screen. This is Highlights Tour.
Not yet. We don't have it yet, Kat.
You don't have it yet?
Neither.
Do you have? So let me go back. Hold on. Here we go, Denise.
Okay.
Okay. So let's try it again. So you didn't get the screen yet.
No.
You all have each other,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We rehearsed this last night, ladies. You still don't have it.
Nope.
Okay, because it came out differently this time.
Okay, let me
Yeah.
event sharing options.
So I'm going to stop it for a second.
Stop it and then start it again and see.
Right. So 1 second. Okay, 1 minute. I'm going to get out of this. Okay. Do you see that?
Now, are you going down at the bottom to where it says share screen?
Hold on.
There we go.
Okay.
Yay.
I did everything but the obvious.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for working with me on that. Okay. Denise has been amazing. So thank you, Denise, for the extra time. That was
You're
wonderful last
wonderful.
night. And it was great to meet some of you last night. So tonight when we got on the call, there you were again. So it's quite wonderful. And I have to tell you, this is really going to be a personal tour of the museum. I have been there for more than 50 years, which I think is actually almost longer than anyone else who is still there. It's really my second home. So a lot of the things that I may say relate to, you know, how I really feel about some of the works and about the museum in general. But overall, my husband and I are, you know, are incredibly passionate about the arts because they make a difference in your life. And I hope after the next, 40 minutes or so, you'll have another wonderful taste of how important they really are, and especially how important the Philadelphia Museum of Art is. So I wanted to start first. Now I have to figure out how to go forward. Hold on, here we go. Whoops. Now I want to go backward. Okay.
There you go.
The museum started in 1876, and that, as many of you realize by doing the math, was the 100th anniversary of the country. It was our centennial celebration, and it occurred in Fairmount Park. What is amazing to me is almost 10 million people came in 1876 to what was then touted as a World's Fair for innovation, and some wonderful things happened aside from the art museum, which premiered in this building to the left, which we know today as Memorial Hall. That was our first home. But also at the Centennial was the first time that you could get Heinz ketchup, Hires root beer. Bananas were offered for 10 cents each, and they were sold with a fork and a spoon. It was the first monorail. It introduced the telegraph, the telephone, and the typewriter. And two people who would become very important showed up also in 1876 that summer, Westinghouse and Eastman. So it really was a time of innovation, but at almost 10 million people, that was approximately 25% of the entire population of the country. Many of the people that came actually came from Europe because it was a World's Fair, but it was incredibly successful. And so in 1876, the building to the left housed the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So in 2026, when the country will celebrate its 250th anniversary, we will celebrate our 150th. But we weren't going to live there forever. As you can see from this beautiful little watercolor, this is the Schuylkill River with the waterworks buildings that you see right at the bottom of the hill. Those waterworks pump the water from the Schuylkill River up into a reservoir at the top of the hill. That hill is called to this day Fairmount. And it was a small hill overlooking the city of Philadelphia. And William Penn actually thought about building his house there when he came in the late 1600s. But instead, he left the Schuylkill for the Delaware and built his house there. So the reservoir was on the top of this Fairmount, and the actual pump for people to get the water was at Center Square, which now houses City Hall. Eventually, the reservoir was decommissioned, actually in 1909. And the reason was because the city founders actually bought up the water on either side of the Schuylkill as far as they thought was needed. And that became Fairmount Park in order to keep the river clean. But they did not count on Manayunk or Conshohocken. So that's where it got polluted. The reservoir was decommissioned. And when plans were set in place in Philadelphia for a grand boulevard to mimic the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the city founders felt, why not put the museum at the end of that parkway? And that, of course, is the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. And the museum today sits on that hill. But I think you can even see in the slide that there is a fence. So you can see that there really was, a reservoir inside. So then they decided to build the museum. It had about a little less than a $4 million budget, but by the time it ended, it ballooned to $13.7 million. And the museum was completed in 1928, 2 years after the 150th anniversary, but they wanted to do it by 1926, but they didn't make it. But one of the things they did, which was quite clever, which this slide brilliantly shows you, is they decided that the building would be built the wings first, because they felt that if they built the center first, the rest of the city would never give them the money to complete the whole building. But if they built the wings first, they would have to connect them. And here is a wonderful picture of the wings of the museum. And the dirt ramp that you see in the center will eventually become the Rocky Steps. Here is another picture of the museum going up. This is the great colonnade that is on the east terrace of the museum. And you can see the beautiful columns, which will eventually become the iconic view of the museum. And this is the west side of the museum, still under construction. And you can see where the wings were, and you can see the center being connecting, you can see the center connecting the two wings. But right now that west center is really like a hole because they're still building it. But here it is as it was before we hired Frank Gehry. This actually is not a bad looking slide. The museum still looks pretty good, but it's a kind of gerrymandered accessibility ramp. And, but Frank Gehry had a vision for the museum, and his vision was he wanted to uncork, meaning he wanted to take out the auditorium, which I will show you in a moment, and clear the clogged arteries of the museum to bring clarity. He basically wanted to bring the building back to its original bones, which he absolutely adored. Frank Gehry loves this building, and he wanted to bring light throughout. Also something he did. This is the new west entrance to the museum. And you can see the ramps are much better. You have a much better sense of the columns on the west side and the three doorways going in. Once through that doors, in the olden days before Frank Gehry, we had a big desk, and behind those three openings in the back, there was a very large wall. So when you got to the museum, the first thing you saw was a desk which got in your way, and then a wall which further got in your way, and you really couldn't see beyond. Frank wanted to open this up and bring in light, which he did. That's the way it looks today. They pushed the admissions. Hold on one second. That's actually my daughter. 1 second. Okay. Told you this was going to be very personal. I'm babysitting my grandchildren. Ah, they picked it up. Okay, I can go back. All righty. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. So you can see that Frank has changed the light. If you look straight ahead through this slide, you will see all the way to what is now the forum. And you can actually, it is not a photograph, but if you look at the very top of the two, there are three openings. If you look at the two on the ends, you're actually looking into the very first floor of the museum. Light literally now goes straight through the building. This is the auditorium that Frank took out. And this is what he created instead, which is a large space called the Forum. And it will be used for art exhibitions, for public performances, as it has been for the past 6 months. But it is a really thrilling space, and it leads on both sides to this vaulted walkway. Now, once upon a time, because this is really the bottom floor of the museum, this walkway was often a little wet because the museum had been the site of a reservoir. But in the early days of the museum, after the 1920s, what you see here is about 320 feet. The full length of the walkway is 640 feet from one side of the Forum to the other. And you can see we left the sign on the left, which shows you that there was a bus route, because you could literally walk from the Spring Garden Street Bridge through the museum all the way out to what was then the East River Drive, which we now call the Kelly Drive. The vaulted walkway, the vaulted ceiling, which you see on this, was also done originally. All Frank Gehry did was light it beautifully, but he opened up the arches that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, again, bringing light into the museum. One thing about the museum when it opened, it was, as many of you've seen, with all the columns and the beautiful spaces, it is like a temple. It really is designed like a Greek temple. And when we first opened in 1928, it was nowhere finished. And the New York Times actually criticized the museum for being a huge Greek garage because there was so much open space. But one thing open space allowed us to do was to attract many works of art and many collections to the museum, because what collectors want is space to show their art. So if you have space for it, they will come. But what the museum, especially the first major director of the museum, who was Fisk Kimball, did, is he went all over the world to try to find things to bring examples of the arts of the whole world into the museum. So yes, the museum is what you would call an encyclopedic museum. But in doing this, they also realized that they might go up against the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. And so the two museums decided on a pact that the Philadelphia Museum would collect everything 1000 AD forward, and the Penn Museum would collect everything 1000 AD backward. Oops, let me go back. So this is a Japanese tea house. It was actually built in 1917, but it is at one very end of the museum. And it really was the whole tea house with the waiting room on the right and the tea house to the left. And in the middle is a beautiful garden that has bamboo and a fountain and a light, so that you actually follow a path to go from the waiting room into the tea house for your tea. Once you leave Japan at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and cross through a beautiful Chinese palace hall from Beijing, you enter this magnificent Indian temple from southern India. What is nice to think about is many times when people think about museums, they think about, I'm going to go see a lot of paintings and maybe sculpture, but people don't necessarily realize they're actually going to see places where people lived, where people worshiped, and you really get a sense of what the world is like just by visiting this building at 26th and the Parkway in Philadelphia. One interesting fact about this beautiful, beautiful temple is that it did exist in Memorial Hall during the World's Fair. It was installed there. It was found in southern Italy in pieces, and they brought it back to Philadelphia and installed it as it once was, as basically a room for assembly before you would go through to the very more sacred chamber at the very end of it. All of the gods represented here are part of the Hindu religion. This is my favorite god of the Hindu religion, and that's really why I wanted to include it. His name is Ganesha, and he was the child of two gods. And they were quite shocked by what he looked like when he was born, because he has a human body, but an elephant head. And yet he is the most beloved of gods. He is the god of happiness and good luck. And what is the tradition in India is that all pregnant women worship this god for the health of their child. But he is adorable. And when you go to India, they have lots of little Ganeshas for you to buy. Some of them are obviously in plastic, but some of them are stone too. But he is just a very cute god. So when you come to the museum, you have to make a little trip to the side gallery to take a look at him. Now I'll switch to European paintings. So yes, now we are with pictures. This picture dates from 1460, and it is by a Northern Renaissance artist, Roger van der Weyden. And what Roger van der Weyden wanted to show you was a serious emotional experience. Yes, we know that it is Christ on the cross. We know that Christ died on the cross, which Roger van der Weyden wants you to see, but he wants you to realize that it actually was more like a universal idea, not just a very specific religious one. And that's why there's no town in the back. You can't really tell where it happened. And you can see that John and Mary on the left side are actually falling from the weight of their grief. And if you get up close to the picture, you can even see the tears that are falling down Mary's face. You almost feel that she could just slide right into the chasm that separates the two. This particular painting is a part of the John G. Johnson collection. And that collection was actually gifted to the city of Philadelphia in the early 1900s. And then when the city wanted to tear down the house, they had to find a home for it. So they brought it to the Philadelphia Museum of Art because remember, we had space and it lived there. There are 1,200 objects in them. Not all of them were ever shown at once, but many of them are because they really are spectacular. But for a very long time, you could always tell that you were in the Johnson collection because it had to be exhibited with other works from the Johnson collection. And the guards wore different outfits because actually it was a gift to the city, not to the museum. After 50 years passed, when they went back to Orphans Court and were given the ability to mix these paintings in proper chronological order with other pictures in the museum. So now they are totally incorporated into the collection of the museum. And this, of course, would be with other paintings from the same time period now. I have to tell you a personal story about this picture. It was being conserved about maybe 10 to 15 years ago. It used to have a gold background, but one of the conservators began to wonder whether that was really true, whether it was the way the picture looked to begin with. And the gold background, of course, would be something we would all expect because that would be a symbol of heaven. But they found this small color of blue underneath in the back, and then they realized that was the original color. I was luckily in the conservation lab with an artist, Ellsworth Kelly, and when he looked at this and he saw the red banners against the gray wall and the blue sky, he said, "This is the first modern painting." And later in this slide lecture, when you see Ellsworth's work, you will understand the reference. Another very realistic work, but in a different way, because Roger van der Weyden wanted to show you real emotion. Jan van Eyck wants to show you every detail possible, because in his mind, God made the world and he was going to put everything he could see in it. This is the story of St. Francis receiving the stigmata, which means the wounds of Christ on the cross. And he was supposed to have received this by himself. So every time someone else is in the picture, usually Brother Leo, he's asleep so that he wouldn't know what was going on. But you can see a city in the background, very unlike the van der Weyden. You can see a city, and that little boat that you see on the lake, we can magnify it. When you come to the museum, we have a little iPad that'll magnify it, and you can see there are people in the boat. Yes, he probably used a brush with one hair on it in order to do this. But I keep thinking he must have had incredible eyesight because that's really hard to carry off. Another wonderful collection that came to the museum is the Kienbusch collection of armor. And here you see something which is extraordinarily rare, and that is a matched set of horse armor with human armor. And the armor collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is truly exceptional, and it is one of the most popular displays that we have. Kids love to go there and see all of the different helmets and the body armor. And I think we only have a few with that where the horses have armor too, but there are also obviously beautiful guns and swords and shields, and it's an exciting place for kids to come. Still in the European painting, but we're moving along in time. This is a very, very powerful picture of Prometheus bound. And basically what Rubens, the artist, wanted to show you was the sacrifice that Prometheus made for mankind. Because remember, he stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, which therefore helped them to control their lives more than the gods wanted. But Peter Paul Rubens was a master artist, means he had a large studio, and he didn't paint everything in his studio. This particular picture he shared with another person in his studio named Franz Snyder, who painted the eagle. And that's because Franz Snyder painted much better eagles than Rubens did, but Rubens painted exceptional flesh. And so you are very aware of the body and the torture that this figure is going through. Now we switch a little bit in feeling to an elegant, elegant room that actually comes from New York. It is a room from an apartment on Fifth Avenue, but it was owned by Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice. She was in Elkins. Her father owned a streetcar company in Philadelphia, and she married George Widener, who was her father's partner, basically putting together two incredibly wealthy Philadelphia families. They were going to have a hotel at the Ritz called the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia, and they went to Europe in 1912 to check out chefs for the hotel. They did, and then they came home on this new ship called the Titanic. She survived, but her husband and her son perished in the Titanic. When she came home a few years later, she bequeathed the Widener Library at Harvard in the name of her son. And at that opening in 1915, she met her second husband, a guy named Alexander Hamilton Rice. And so this is actually now called the Rice Room, but everything in it is of the finest quality from the 1700s in France. It has Sèvres porcelain on either side of the fireplace. The chairs are magnificent Louis XVI, as is the furniture. The tapestries were designed by Boucher and made in the Gobelin factory. The rug actually comes from the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So everything in it is totally officially French, except for the architecture, which comes out of a Fifth Avenue apartment house. This particular room is totally correct. It is the best example of Robert Adam classical architecture and interior design outside of Great Britain. And interestingly enough, it's exactly almost the same year as all the furniture, et cetera, in the room we just saw. But this one also has an interesting story because this room was first installed in the museum with different colors. And then sadly, we actually had a leak. The air conditioner from the top leaked, and so there was a lot of damage to the room. But it was fixed, it was conserved. And along the way, when they were conserving it, they found this magnificent turquoise color with the rose color on the bottom, because it is quite shocking and quite bright and quite bold, but it is correct. And a lot of this decoration came from, or was inspired by, the founding of Pompeii and Herculaneum during the 18th century. Because at that point, they didn't know that much about classical design until they actually saw what was done there. And then everything changed. At the same time, basically, again, almost the same year, is this room from a house in Philadelphia, which seems kind of silly, doesn't it? That we have a room at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that actually, the house still exists at 3rd, right between Locust and Walnut. The house is actually the Powell House, and it does exist today, and the rest of it has been conserved. But when the museum took this room from the 2nd floor, the house was in very bad shape. So that room today in the Powell House is a recreation. So I just wanted to show you, again, a beautiful house from around the same time, but the classical inspiration has not yet come to America. So everything in this room is much curvier than it was in the Robert Adam room that we saw before. Now we're still in the European paintings department, and this particular picture is actually, in a way, a history picture. It is the burning of the Houses of Parliament, which actually took place in 1834. And the artist, Turner, was there. He actually was one of the people in one of those boats. He went back, so he made sketches on the scene, and Turner loved storms. He loved light. He loved lightning. And of course, he absolutely adored fire. And the orange and yellow fire against the white stone of the bridge was fascinating to him. But Turner also captured not just the tragedy of the fire, but he captured all the people on the shore who were looking at it. So he would have made, as I said, sketches of the painting, but then he went back to the studio and finished the picture. Because at this point in time, in the early 1800s, people were not painting outside. That would come later. Now we're going to switch to the American ring. And the Gehry project allowed us to add 12,500 new square feet of exhibition space for our American collections. And at the very beginning of those galleries is this wampum belt that was presented to the settlers from the Indians. And you can see the two figures are holding hands. It's actually in the collection of the Historical Society of Philadelphia, but they have lent it to us for a while, which is quite wonderful. Another example of two different kind of designs, like the two different rooms we saw, but here we see in this room in the New American Galleries, we see the highest level of achievement in Chippendale furniture on the left. And we see the highest level from Pennsylvania German furniture on the right. They actually are both made around the same exact time. But the one on the left is following the Anglican Chippendale style, and the one on the right is following a much more Germanic type of style. It's heavier, it is not as elegant, but the inlay is very, very important to them. But it is fascinating to see two amazing works that are really only separated by about 40 miles, but worlds, truly worlds apart. One representing the English tradition and the other the German. This painting is actually a revolutionary painting. As you can see, it is a portrait of Thomas Mifflin, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, and his wife. It is by Copley, and it is close up an extraordinary picture. But what she is doing is a revolutionary act because she has her own loom. And the British did not want there to be a domestic factory or anyone doing, making fabric on their own, because they wanted to charge a tariff on all the fabrics coming into the United States. So if there was domestic production, that was not good for the English. So here she is, looking very proud, looking very determined that she is making her own fabric. And her husband is right next to her, gazing at her very lovingly, also very, very proud of his wife. But one little detail that I'd love you to look at is the relationship of their hands, because his hand is right over hers. And this little detail is one way the artist tells you that this was a very, very good marriage. Another wonderful painter in America in the 18th century was Charles Willson Peale. He was a Philadelphian. He had lots of children. His self-portrait is on the right, and in the center is a painting he did where he wanted to deceive you. It is two of his sons, Raphael and Titian Peale, going up a staircase. And to make the illusion look even more real, he added the door frame and he added the step. When conservation was looking at this picture, they realized somewhere around, shoulder height, there were lots of finger marks because people were actually touching the picture to be sure that it was a painting and it wasn't actually open space that the boys were walking through. So it is amazing how many things you can learn from conservation. The picture on the left is also by Charles Willson Peale, and it's of a man who was a freed slave, bought a house in Philadelphia, and at 83 years old, commissioned Charles Willson Peale, the greatest painter at that moment in the city, to paint his portrait. And it is quite beautiful. Another reason to come and see how sensitive and charming this man is. As the New American Galleries began with them with the settlers and the Indians holding hands, what we see here is William Penn sitting down with his treaty, making the treaty with the Indians that he found here. And so this is called Peaceable Kingdom. And it is in the last room, and it is actually the last painting of that particular part of the American wing. So it's just a wonderful parenthesis to start with peace and to end with peace. And of course, a wonderful idea, which in the meantime had gone through many iterations that weren't always peaceful. Now we leave the American wings specifically and go to other paintings. And I just want to point this one out. It is by Henry Osawa Tanner, an African-American artist who is painting the Annunciation. In many Annunciation pictures, there is an angel, but in Tanner's way, there is light. And it is light that is bringing goodness and to Mary. And this was the first contemporary painting bought by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it just reminds you that everything old is actually new when it's first made. Another great American picture is this one by Thomas Eakins, which actually had its debut at the Centennial Celebration in 1876, at which point Thomas Eakins was only 32 years old. So he was quite young. What is happening here is Dr. Gross, who was a surgeon at Jefferson Medical College, is performing an operation, and you can see all the people around him. What you also see, which is quite shocking, is none of them are wearing gloves, because at this point they did not know about infection. There is another major painting, but really not quite as good as this one, which is owned by the University of Pennsylvania, which is called the Agnew Clinic, which was painted 10 years later. And the surgeon and all the staff there are wearing gloves. So in between, that's when they found out it was important. Another history painting, really. This is a battle in the Civil War, but it was fought off of the coast of France. And like Turner watched the Houses of Parliament burn, Manet watched this battle take place. And he did, like Turner, make sketches at the scene, and then he went back to the studio to complete the work. This is one of the latest works in the Johnson collection, because the Johnson collection did not go very much past the 1870s. So now we're in the Impressionist gallery of the museum, and here is one beautiful wall full of Monet's poplars. Monet, as you know, liked to see the same subject in different light and from different angles. And this wall gives you a wonderful preview of that. This is a world tour, basically, through the museum. It would take you, I don't know how many hours to travel as far as we have traveled, but we're going to keep going. This magnificent room has some of the best examples of Impressionist painting, late 19th century painting that we have in the collection. And it starts with Van Gogh on the left, the great Cézanne bathers in the middle, and Cézanne's two versions of Mont Saint-Victoire on the right. So I'm going to start with the sunflowers again. Again, meaning my phone is ringing, but they answered it. Thank you. My grandchildren are being terrific. So Van Gogh created the sunflowers. There are about 5 of them. And he created them for actually Paul Gauguin, because he wanted Paul Gauguin to come and visit him, which he did in 1888. And he wanted to set up the room for him, have it be a place that he would really, really like. And the sunflower pictures was one of the pictures that he was going to have in the room. Paul Gauguin did come and visit Van Gogh, but he only stayed about a month. And as much as Van Gogh really wanted it to work out for longer than that and create this wonderful art studio in the South, it did not. And Gauguin left, went back to Paris, and I don't think the two of them ever spoke again. At the end of that room is the great painting by Paul Cézanne called The Great Bathers, which was done very much toward the end of his life. Cézanne died in 1906. There are 3 major bathers that Cézanne did, one in the National Gallery, one in the Barnes, and then ours is the very last. The other 2 are actually half the size. This is the largest painting by double that Cezanne had ever made. And he actually had to create a special doorway in his studio to get it in and out. When this painting was bought during the height of the Depression in the 1930s, there was a cartoon about it. And the cartoon was basically showing an impoverished family with empty cabinets. And the husband comes home and the husband is carrying this picture and the husband says, "Look what I bought." So you have to always be careful, different times, but we are so grateful that we have this masterpiece. It is truly one of the most important works of art that we have in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And here is Cezanne's Mont Saint-Victoire, just one of the two that we have, which is quite wonderful. Most museums do not have two Mont Saint-Victoires. Cezanne painted this painting from many different vantage points, and this one also was painted toward the end of his life. But what is most important about this picture is that Cezanne, even though he is painting something that he sees in nature, he's not poking a hole in the canvas to create a three-dimensional world. He's making you realize this painting is valid for its own self, that the two-dimensionality of the work matters. So as much as you see it recede into the distance, you also see how the painting is very vertical. That beautiful purpley color that you see on the front is also reflected in the sky in the back. Cezanne's influence in the 20th century was profound, which is what the Cezanne and Beyond exhibition was all about, because we wanted to show that artists of the next generation revered him. Picasso called him the father of us all, and Matisse called him my one and only master. So here we have a picture by Pablo Picasso, painted the same year, 1906, as the Cezanne Mont Saint-Victoire I just showed you, but a very different style. And again, this is not a three-dimensional Picasso that you see. You're very aware of the surface of the picture. And one interesting thing about it is, yes, he is showing that he is an artist, but there's one very important thing he left out, and that's the brush. Because when Picasso felt that what made him an artist was how he saw the world. So his eyes are very important, and they are piercing. Another Picasso picture from about 20 years later is this Three Musicians, which is actually Picasso and two of his friends. And it's fun to look at all the clues, to see the violin string, to see the accordion in the right, and to see the recorder in the center. It's fun to find all these clues, but what it looks like most of all is a very musical picture because there is such a rhythm to it. Léger did this picture around a little earlier than the Three Musicians. And for Léger, again, we see how all the colors are sitting on the surface of the picture. Yes, it depicts a sprawling metropolis, which is actually New York, but you can see the bridges, you can see the people, you can see the signs and the billboards, and try to remember that Léger was French, and coming to America, all of the signs, et cetera, didn't really make sense. So they became abstract shapes and colors to him. And that's what's actually seen in the picture. When I started, I talked about the empty garage, the Greek garage on the top of the Fairmount in Philadelphia. And that Greek garage and having that space allowed us to bring in the Ahrensburg collection from California. And that collection has more Brancusis than any other museum in America. And here we see just a few of them, from the bird in space on the left to the adorable kiss in the middle, which was actually a tombstone. But these two figures are like pared down to the basic elements. Their arms around each other. She has long hair. She obviously has breasts. And it's really a charming, charming little sculpture. More of the Ahrensburg collection, of course, is the collection of Duchamp. Philadelphia is like Duchamp Central, and Duchamp, like Cezanne, was very important to the artists who came after. This is Duchamp's large glass. And this is two examples of Duchamp's nudes descending the staircase. Number one on the left and number two on the right. Number 2 created such an impression when it had, I mean, people were shocked by it. And I like to think that they were shocked because this was a woman on the move. In 1913, when this was a part of the Armory show, everyone could not understand this picture. Yes, there was cinema, very new, but there was cinema. And here is a nude, which there had been many nudes over the centuries, but here was a nude in motion. And that was shocking for a picture. Some people called it like it looked like an explosion in a shingle factory. But my favorite critic was the one who said, trying to find the nude in the nude descending the staircase is like trying to find the moon in the Moonlight Sonata. We accept music to be abstract, but we're a little harder in accepting it in painting. Another Duchamp. This one is called Fountain, but we all know what it is. It's a urinal. But it's a perfect example of Duchamp taking things out of regular life that were made by someone and exhibiting them, and therefore beginning to question what is a work of art. And that conversation continues to this day. Jasper Johns was very much influenced by Duchamp. And actually, the very large picture that you see in the back actually carries a profile of Duchamp on the lower left side in what you can see is basically the stretcher from a painting. And you can see that Jasper also puts in different things that you would recognize, like a light bulb. And I think there's a shoe over there. So these are made out of metal and they're sculpted, but still they're like everyday objects that he puts in the gallery. This picture is actually one of our promised gifts to the museum. And just to give you a sense that paintings aren't always complex. There is so much to them though. This is called Nines. And the reason it's called Nines is because it has 9 blues, 9 reds, and 9 yellows. And that's truly the reason that it's called Nines. But it is made from kind of this pattern that he saw, that John saw on a wall in Harlem way back in 1964. And this painting dates from 2006. And there are many elements to it, which are hard to see on the slide. So there is much more to it than its title, but it is just funny that after creating such a complex picture with pieces of wood attached on either side, and the paint itself is magnificent, that he would give it such a simple title. Here it is actually in the Johns Gallery in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Often many of the pictures that Keith and I have the pleasure of living with are lent to the museum, and eventually most of them will be going there. But I actually have to say, I think the museum has definitely run out of space already, so I don't expect them all to be exhibited for a certain amount of time. Another artist that we have in concentration, because we have Duchamp, Brancusi, and Jasper Johns, we also have work by Ellsworth Kelly. These are from the early 50s, and they're very simple. They're actually, as you can see, black and white, but it's the shapes that matter the most to Ellsworth. But what also mattered to him was color. And remember, I talked about Ellsworth way back in the beginning with the earlier picture and those banners hanging over that gray wall with a blue background. Ellsworth is very much concerned about the shape, the color, and its relationship to the wall. This picture is more than 12 feet wide. So when you are in the middle of it, you cannot see anything else, and you are immersed in this color. Karen wanted me to include this boy who usually lives in our backyard. This is actually a picture from the backyard. It's by an artist named Charles Ray, who right now is having an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and Pinault's new collection in Paris also. Basically, 70% of Charlie's art at this moment is on view to the world, which is astonishing. So what Charles Ray's influence is basically Greek sculpture. This is a modern day Kouros, and it is a boy holding a frog. And the most important part of this sculpture is the relationship of the boy's gaze to the frog. And according to the artist, if the boy is too invested in the frog, then we don't want to have anything to do with him. But if he is just enough invested in the frog to be interesting to us, then we are involved with both of them. And here's a little image of the frog. The boy is smooth and beautiful, but the frog is very, very scaly. Way back when I talked about the new Descending the Staircase, I talked about how shocking it was to have something move. Well, now you all know video art is something that is quite normal. And when I think about this picture, which is by this, not picture, this installation by Bruce Nauman, it is a video. It is a video of Bruce Nauman walking back and forth through his studio, because a studio for the artist is where the discovery happens. And he is walking toward the back of it, turning around and coming back. And what Nauman has also done is taken it apart. So everything seems to move. But if you remember what that nude, and I'm going to go back because I think it is so fascinating, what that looked like. This was shown in America in 1913. And this Nauman, I think, carries the date of 2013. So what we learn from art is everything old, 100 years old, is new again. The relationship between these two objects is really astonishing. And the last artwork that I'm going to show you is this one, which is also a video, and that's why the back is blurred. And this is a video of the Statue of Liberty. And what the artist is doing is there is a helicopter that is going around and around the statue so that you get to see it up close. It's almost like it's surveillance, but it gives you a helicopter view of that statue like you could never see anywhere else. And at the end of the day, it is art that lets us see things in a way we could not have before imagined. So this is the temple. It looks like a temple. This is the great staircase hall of the museum. And at the end is Diana, who is obviously on the hunt. So when you come to the museum, I hope you will all hunt for all the works that I have, shown you today, because that's what's so exciting, is what are we going to look for and what are we going to feel when we see it? So the museum is a temple on that mount. And one of the early directors of the Philadelphia Museum of Art called the museum the Triumph of Fairmount. And I like to think that it truly is, not just because people go up those rocky steps and feel very triumphant at the top of them, but because maybe they also come inside and are inspired by everything that is inside this wonderful institution. So thank you very, very much for letting me share this, my second home, with all of you. Thank you. Now, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, that was really, really wonderful, Kathy, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start. I had a question, just how
So should I
did
push
you-
escape so we can see each other?
Please do that.
Okay, all right.
Great.
Hi.
Yeah. So my question is, how did you get started collecting art?
Well, when we got married in 1969, we wanted to collect art, so we just would go different places and buy things. But since I was at the museum, and he was also very curious, we started really to think about collecting contemporary art and art that related to our time, artists that came to prominence in the time that we were collecting, not older ones. And so in the early 1980s, we created a hit list, literally, of the artists that we wanted to buy. And we would find out when they were having exhibitions. We would call early because you had to. And that's how it all happened. And we knew that we wanted to buy the best example of the artists we admired. And if we only bought 1 or 2 things a year and we didn't really sell anything, then that would be fine. And that's pretty much what happened, except along the way, there were many other artists that we saw that we didn't mean to see, but you know, you walk by a gallery and you decide to walk in and you think, wow, that's pretty good. So the depth of the collection comes from the artists we have collected in depth. You know, on that hit list, after we bought one, Keith would say, well, do we want another one? And that's how we had more than one of many artists. But the breadth of the collection comes from our seeing things along the way and deciding, you know, they're pretty important too.
Mm.
And it's, you know, it's gone on for a very, very long time. Since Keith passed away, I've bought just a very few things, a very different kind of concentration, but it's thrilling. It's really thrilling when you have something that you absolutely adore and realize I really want it, and you go that extra mile to get it. And that rush is really exciting. And I don't have the rush anymore because it's a little easier, but it is a thrilling thing to do. But the best thing about it is we got to meet many of the artists, and they have added tremendously to life for us. They've really enriched our lives. The way they see the world, the way they talk about it, it's just wonderful to experience it.
That is wonderful. Is there anything at the museum? What are some of your favorite pieces at the museum?
Well, I guess having worked on Cézanne for so long, because I did my senior thesis on that Mont Saint-Victoire that I showed you. And one thing which I told Karen and all the other sorority sisters that are on this call, that when I came to the museum to do the work on that picture, you know, to look at that picture in depth, it wasn't hanging up anymore, which I later learned as a guide was not a shocking thing. They changed things. So you come in all prepared to do a certain tour, and then you've got to, you know, punt. But I found it in conservation, and I found it in conservation without a frame, just leaning against the wall. So to truly understand, that's the way the artist sees the work. The artist doesn't do the work in a frame on a wall presented to you. You know, it's a real thing. And to really confront the objectness of the work was really important to me. So I would say that Mont Saint-Victoire and the Cézanne Great Bathers are very special to me, as are all of the other contemporary artists whose work we happen to be very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But I do love the Roger van der Weyden. If I had to tell you, if I shouldn't be so editorial, but it is probably the greatest work that we have in the museum.
Wow.
Yeah, it is absolutely astonishing. And you think that it is over 500 years old. Amazing.
That is amazing.
But those people could be us. Those tears are real. Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit about, I know when many of us go to museums, we see that something has been given to the museum temporarily by a family, a foundation. Does the museum reach out to folks who have private collections, or do people like you who have the private collections tell the museum, what you'd like to offer them to be on exhibit?
That would be wonderful, but yes, we reach out. But it's interesting. There are two major modern collections. One I mentioned by name, Ahrensburg, which has the Duchamps and the Brancusis. The other one is Gallatin, and the Gallatin collection actually was where the three musicians in the Léger came from. And the Gallatin collection actually came to Philadelphia because, yes, we had room, and NYU was throwing him out. He had a gallery in New York, and it was a part of NYU, and NYU wanted to do something else with the space. The Ahrensburg collection was actually on view at UCLA, and they wanted to build a building where Ahrensburg was. So our director, same director for both collections, kind of, heard about all this and then would go court both of these collectors, and those collections came to the museum. I think universities have better judgment now.
Yeah.
But in those days, art was not important, which is why it's very important for Keith and I at Penn, right?
Mm. Are there any exhibitions coming up this year that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think the ones that are coming up next is Sean Scully, who is a contemporary artist, opens April 7th. But there's a Matisse exhibition coming in September, which I think is going to be spectacular. And it's going to be all about Matisse in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, as some of you may know, that is when Matisse came to Philadelphia to do the mural at the Barnes. So a
Wow.
lot of what will be seen at the museum relates to the Barnes mural. And the Barnes is just a few blocks down from the museum. So easy to do both.
Mm-hmm. We had a question. How does a museum decide on what it will collect? What pieces it will take?
It's there is a process. It's basically up to the curators to create the vision, but pretty much at this point, many of the collections are pretty, set. But works of art come up for sale all the time, or collectors of older works are eager to place them in a museum or are eager to sell them. And, we find out about that. And then basically it's a curatorial decision. But once the curator makes the decision, there has to be the money in place to buy it. There has to be, for instance, in the contemporary realm, if the contemporary curator decides they would like to purchase a work of art for the museum, it is up to the contemporary committee to accept it. And if the committee accepts it, then it's up to the board of trustees to accept it. And I know that my husband was head of the contemporary committee when they did accept the urinal that I showed you, the fountain of Marcel Duchamp. I was not there for the discussion, but I understand it was fascinating.
Well, that's really, this has really been wonderful, Kathy. And I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for your time. It was just wonderful seeing
Thank
all
you.
those paintings and pieces, and I can't wait to go back to the museum now. So we want to thank Kathy for her time and thank all of you for being here and for your donations. And I am going to turn it over to Denise for some closing remarks.
I just wanted to make sure that we thank Karen Ball for recommending Kathy to us. And Kathy, it was absolutely amazing program. We can't thank you enough. And we will be making a donation to the museum on behalf of Sisterhood. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed it.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, come and see me at the museum. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. It was wonderful to meet you. Thank you for letting me
Bye-bye.
show off our beautiful home.
Bye.
Bye.